They laughed at his coat, whispered about his seat, and questioned if someone like him could ever afford to sit in first class. But no one on that plane had any idea who they had just humiliated. He didn't wear wealth like a badge, didn't need anyone's approval. And when he quietly handed over his boarding pass, they still looked past him like he didn't belong. From the moment he stepped on board, the smirks, the stares, and the patronizing tones weren't just discomfort. They were an unspoken verdict, handed down by people too blinded by appearance to recognize what power really looks like. This is not just a story about a black man on a plane. It's about how prejudice walks freely in polished shoes and tailored uniforms, and how dignity doesn't need to announce itself to reshape everything. What started as quiet cruelty at 35,000 feet would soon unravel a truth no one was ready for. If stories like this make you pause, challenge what you see, or remind you of what justice should look like, hit that subscribe button, drop a like, and tell us what moment hit you the hardest and where in the world are you watching from. We want to hear your voice. Marcus Washington stepped onto Flight 316 with the quiet precision of someone who didn't need to prove a thing. His overcoat, a worn navy wool blend, hung cleanly from his shoulders. Beneath it, a dark gray suit clung to him like it had been tailored that morning. He didn't wear a Rolex or a flashy designer label, just the kind of understated confidence that comes from surviving far more brutal rooms than any aircraft captain. The airport had already run its gauntlet of micro-expressions and sidelong stares, but Marcus was used to that. What he didn't expect was how quickly the temperature would shift the second he set foot inside the plane. At the front stood a young flight attendant with perfect posture and a smile frozen mid-politeness. Her eyes flicked to his face, then passed him toward the other passengers still boarding. Without waiting, she motioned toward the rear of the aircraft and spoke with a rehearsed tone that carried just enough command to make it clear she assumed compliance. "Economy's down the aisle, sir." Marcus stopped, produced his ticket, and held it calmly. "Seat 1C, first class." She looked at it once, blinked, and offered no apology, only a stilted "one moment, please," before disappearing behind the curtain. Her reaction wasn't new, it was just more blatant than most. He took his seat anyway, calmly removing his coat and stowing his bag. Behind him, two men snickered audibly. Must be someone's assistant, or maybe they let them cash in rewards points now. Marcus heard them. They knew he did, and they didn't care. His skin was the trigger, his presence the offense. A woman one row over glanced at his shoes, not designer, but immaculately clean, then at his face, then away. "Nudon looked like you belonged here." Haley returned minutes later with another crew member, clipboard in hand. "We're just verifying the manifest," the man said. Marcus said nothing. He knew the protocol: challenge without accusing, delay without denying. It was the corporate version of polite racism, engineered to leave no bruises but still wound you on the inside. He sat there, back straight, breathing slow, as the conversations buzzed louder around him. One man lowered his sunglasses to get a better look. Another leaned toward his wife and whispered something about upgrades getting out of hand. Marcus could have said 1,000 things. He could have mentioned the 8-figure merger he was closing in Zurich. He could have pulled out his platinum executive pass, the kind that didn't just grant you access to first class, but made airlines grovel for your business. He could have opened the leather-bound folio in his bag containing the contract that would eventually give him controlling interest in the very airline whose crew was now second-guessing his seat assignment. Instead, he let them sit in it, let them feel justified, let them believe whatever story they needed to make sense of a black man sitting in seat 1C without apology. He leaned back slightly, closed his eyes, and waited for the turbulence to come, not from the clouds, but from the people who didn't yet know who they were dealing with. Around him, assumptions fermented into certainty, whispers hardened into judgment, and the final pieces of a quiet. The hum of the cabin had settled into a quiet murmur, passengers flipping through in-flight magazines or scrolling through their phones as the final boarding announcements echoed faintly from the gate. Marcus remained seated in 1C, composed, legs crossed, a legal pad balanced neatly on his knee, scribbling a few last-minute thoughts about the upcoming deal in Zurich. From the corner of his eye, he noticed a flight attendant approaching again. Not Haley this time, but a taller man named Brent, sleeves perfectly pressed, a forced grin etched across his face like it had been sewn on under pressure. With no greeting, Brent leaned in slightly and commented, half-lowered voice trying to sound routine, that Marcus would need to remove his coat. Marcus looked up, brows slightly raised, and asked why. Brent hesitated for half a second before citing a vague cabin dress code, mentioning how first-class passengers were expected to maintain a certain appearance standard. Marcus nodded once and unbuttoned his coat without argument, revealing the tailored suit beneath, but inside, something twisted. As Brent turned away, Marcus scanned the cabin again. A man across the aisle wore a stretched college sweatshirt, untied sneakers, and wireless earbuds, bobbing his head to music audible even through the cabin's ambient noise. The woman, one row up, wore a travel hoodie, designer perhaps, but no more formal than gym wear. No one had asked them to adjust their clothing. Marcus folded his coat and set it neatly beside him. He knew this wasn't about a dress code. It was a test, one of many. Like a stone skipped across water, the ripples of quiet judgment were never about the splash. They were about control. Brent returned moments later, this time with a nervous glance toward the cockpit. He stood by Marcus's seat longer than necessary, feigning a check on cabin storage, before muttering into his headset and stepping away. A full 5 minutes passed before another figure appeared. A man in a pressed Navy uniform, silver wings shining under the LED lighting. The captain. His expression was neutral, neither welcoming nor aggressive, but firm in a way that said decisions were made long before he arrived. Seeing knelt slightly to Marcus's eye level and asked if everything was all right. "Hell yes, Mark." The captain didn't budge. He continued, stating they had received a report of non-compliance with flight crew instructions, and that all passengers needed to follow guidelines or risk intervention. Marcus said nothing at first. He met the captain's gaze and replied simply that he had followed every instructions, including removing the coat as asked, and had done nothing disruptive. The captain nodded curtly, said he appreciated cooperation, then stood and left, not before adding one last note, that further disturbances would not be tolerated and might result in removal from the aircraft. Marcus sat back, breathed in slowly, and watched him disappear behind the cockpit door. The cabin was quiet again, but this time, the quiet felt heavy. The man in 2B tilted his head slightly, as if trying to piece together whether Marcus had truly done something wrong, or whether this was about something else entirely. 2 rows back, someone pulled out a phone and pretended to scroll, but the camera was angled just enough to capture the exchange. Marcus felt the weight of that lens too, not because he feared exposure, but because he had lived too long under the microscope not to notice when it focused. He leaned back and rested his head against the seat, his mind calculating timelines and thresholds. He would not let this become a spectacle, but he would not forget it either. Another round of drinks came through. Haley returned, serving champagne with forced cheer to the passengers in front of Marcus, her tray stopping inches short of his seat before veering off without a word. She hadn't made eye contact. The message was clear. No confrontation, no overt denial, just erasure. The man in the college hoodie got his drink. Marcus received nothing. He didn't ask. He didn't raise his hand. That wasn't the game being played here. Silence was part of the performance. Denial without accusation. Enforcement without escalation. Yet Marcus could still feel the residue of scrutiny, like the faint static of a radio left on just below perception. The warning from the captain still rang quietly beneath the cabin noise. And though Marcus had complied with every instruction, he understood now that his presence had been recategorized. He was no longer just a passenger. He was a disruption carefully contained, and the real game, the performance of control, was still underway. 15 minutes into ascent, a young man seated several rows back pulled out his phone. He had been watching the earlier exchange, the coat, the captain, the tension. Within seconds, a flight attendant spotted him. Brent, the same one who had first approached Marcus, now moved quickly down the aisle, his smile gone, posture tight. He leaned over the young man, voice low but firm, and told him filming inside the aircraft was prohibited. When the passenger replied that he was capturing a public situation, Brent's voice dropped further. Delete the video or security would be called upon landing. Meanwhile, Marcus hadn't moved. He had noticed the confrontation but said nothing. He knew the weight of a camera lens in these situations could both protect and provoke. It could be weaponized just as quickly as dismissed. Instead, he closed his eyes for a moment and let the reality settle around him. A surveillance state disguised as customer service, a hierarchy of compliance masked as protocol. When he opened them again, flight attendants were preparing for dinner service. White tablecloths appeared, silverware gleamed in the ambient light, and the scent of warming entrees rows ahead of him were served. First, one by one, glasses were filled, trays laid out, menus referenced with delicate nods. He waited, calmly, patiently. But when Haley passed by, she didn't stop. Brent followed, pushing the cart, eyes darting briefly toward Marcus, then back to the list clipped beside. The meals. They moved past his row without a word. Marcus turned his head slightly. The man across the aisle, the one in the hoodie, had already received his plate, still browsing the dessert options. The couple next to him, too, were midway through their appetizers. Marcus looked forward again, hands still resting, back still straight. Finally, Brent returned, not with a tray, but with a soft apology laced with disinterest. There had been a miscount in the catering manifest. His meal had been omitted, nothing available. They would try to find him a snack box from economy. Marcus didn't speak. He didn't need to. The silence between them was louder than any argument could be. Brent laughed. Haley didn't return. The noise of cutlery and conversation filled the cabin again, light laughter from other rows bubbling over the ambient hum. To everyone else, the moment passed. But for Marcus, it was a declaration. Not just exclusion, but humiliation. A reminder. You are here, but you are not one of us. The omission wasn't just food. It was a signal, a social message dressed as an error. Marcus shifted slightly, pulling a pen from his briefcase. On the corner of the legal pad, he wrote a single line. Noted. The ink dried almost instantly. He set the pen down and watched as the sky outside shifted from gold to deep indigo. Somewhere over the Atlantic, a cabin full of strangers would finish their meals, adjust their seats, and drift into sleep. But Marcus wouldn't be sleeping tonight. Marcus remained seated, hands folded neatly in his lap, eyes focused forward. The empty tray in front of him, untouched by any actual food, had been collected without comment. He was still dressed as he had been when he boarded, still sitting upright, still silent, but now a new layer had settled in the space around him. He had become invisible by design, not neglect. They hadn't forgotten to make him forgettable. A soft chime rang overhead. One of the attendants moved through first class, pausing occasionally to adjust a blanket or respond to a request with a manufactured smile. As she passed row 1, the couple seated behind Marcus leaned forward. The woman, pale, hair pulled into a tight bun, whispered something. The man beside her nodded in agreement. It was quiet, but not enough to escape notice. Their tones weren't panicked, just uncomfortable, a kind of practiced concern, the sort that didn't rise to accusation, but didn't need to. The attendant listened, then straightened and offered a nod. A few minutes later, she returned with another crew member. Together, they approached Marcus. Without preamble, the taller attendant leaned in and lowered his voice, explaining that, due to a concern from other passengers, it would be better if Marcus moved to a different seat. No mention of who complained or why, just concerned, just protocol. Marcus remained expressionless, his eyes locked on the small brass pin at the center of the man's uniform. He didn't ask questions. He didn't protest. He stood, reached for his bag and followed. As he walked down the aisle, eyes followed him. Not many, just enough. Some passengers pretended not to notice, turning their faces toward windows or burying themselves in headphones, but others watched openly, curiosity flickering beneath half-raised brows. The new seat was in row 27, near the lavatories. It was narrower, the cushion thinner, and the armrest immovable. It smelled faintly of industrial soap and fatigue. Marcus sat down without a word, placing his bag beneath the seat in front of him. Around him, passengers shifted subtly, pretending not to see what had just happened. A woman in yoga pants glanced at him once and quickly looked away. A child 2 rows up asked something in a loud voice, but his mother hushed him before he could finish. To them, this wasn't injustice, this was theater. They had all watched it unfold, moment by moment, and none had intervened, because deep down, they believed the system didn't make mistakes. If he was being moved, there must have been a reason. Even if they didn't know it, they trusted it existed. In the galley, 2 flight attendants exchanged hushed words. One of them, a younger woman with nervous eyes, asked if the man had done something. The other shrugged. The couple said he made them uneasy, a word with no substance but enormous reach, a word that carried weight when spoken in the right tone, by the right person, at the right moment. No policy needed to be broken, no action needed to be punished, just a suggestion of discomfort, and suddenly a seat assignment became conditional. Back in row 27, Marcus reached into his jacket and pulled out a tablet. He powered it on slowly, swiping through files and folders until he landed on a secured document. It was labeled in clean serif font, a name that would mean nothing to most but everything to the airline. He opened it, skimmed the contents, and let the light from the screen wash over his face. His eyes remained cold, focused. This wasn't just mistreatment anymore. This was a calculated erasure. They weren't just trying to move him, they were trying to erase his presence from the front of the aircraft, to make sure his silhouette didn't disturb the symmetry of privilege. In the first-class cabin, now physically removed from his presence, the atmosphere had resumed its polished rhythm. Champagne was poured into fluted glasses, pillows were fluffed with courteous efficiency, and white-gloved passed dessert menus like sacred scripts to the chosen few. Among them sat Arthur Langford, a man whose name still echoed in the media for all the wrong reasons. A corporate magnate whose company had settled 3 high-profile lawsuits involving racial discrimination, 2 of them just last year. And yet on this flight, he was royalty. Langford had boarded late, escorted to seat 1A with a smile so wide it bordered on theatrical. Haley had greeted him like an old friend, her voice higher, sweeter, her movements fluid with dirt. Brent had adjusted the overhead for him without request. A third attendant offered him a warm towel with both hands, bowing slightly, as if in silent apology for the mere inconvenience of air travel. He laughed loudly, legs stretched, jacket draped behind his chair by someone else's hand. None of the tension from earlier remained, not here, not for him. Langford had arrived, and the cabin had realigned itself to accommodate. Meanwhile, in the rear of the plane, Marcus shifted his weight slightly. He wasn't watching Langford directly. He didn't need to. He had memorized the pattern long ago, the way systems contorted to comfort the familiar, to soothe the wealthy when they came in familiar skin. What he hadn't expected was what came next. As Brent walked down the aisle with his tablet in hand, Marcus's eyes caught something unexpected. The attendant paused just beside his row, answering a whispered question from another staff member. In doing so, the screen of his tablet tilted just enough into Marcus's line of sight. There, in the glow of cabin lights, was a chat window. Casual, internal, but unguarded. A recent message hovered at the bottom. It read, "The guy with the thrift store coat finally took the hint. We can breathe now." Marcus blinked once. His face didn't change. He simply leaned back again, eyes closing for a moment as if processing a bit of turbulence. But inside, a shift occurred. What had been speculation was now confirmed. This hadn't been a miscommunication or a misunderstanding. This was culture, shared, spoken, unhidden. It lived in their fingertips and their private group chats. It pulsed through the hierarchy of the cabin and danced between every sidelong glance and withheld courtesy. He wasn't just being managed, he was being mocked. And worse, they felt safe enough to do it casually. In the first-class galley, Haley stood beside another attendant, laughing softly. Her phone buzzed in her hand. She glanced at it and turned the screen slightly toward her colleague. Marcus couldn't hear the words, but he didn't need to. The timing, the glances, the tightened lips trying not to smile, it told the story clearly. Another message, another joke. This time, not about him moving seats, but his appearance. Coat, again. The posture. The fact that he hadn't raised his voice even once. How amusing it must have seemed. A man so well dressed but so easily dismissed, like watching a lion muzzled by politeness. The passengers around Marcus remained oblivious or indifferent. Some had fallen asleep, others flipped through magazines or tapped idly on tablets. One woman watched a rom-com on her screen, pausing only to sip wine and wipe a tear of laughter. To them, Marcus's isolation was already history, folded neatly into the normal rhythm of air travel. But for Marcus, The flight was becoming a living dossier. He didn't need to record video. He didn't need to speak. The truth was revealing itself, frame by frame, through their own casual carelessness. He opened his briefcase again and slid out a second device, a secure encrypted phone used for internal correspondence at his firm. He tapped a message without urgency. It was addressed to someone listed only as HQ Ops Legal. He didn't explain the situation in detail, just a time-stamped, a flight number, and the phrase "pattern confirmed. Proceed accordingly." He powered it off immediately, then placed it beside him, hand resting on the leather as if it were an old companion. Marcus remained in his seat, not slouched but straight-backed, fingers resting atop the closed briefcase beside him, eyes trained forward yet seeing everything. He had stopped tracking time. The insult had evolved beyond a personal slight. It had become structural, procedural, and now prescientable. Around him, no one said a word, and that silence was beginning to speak volumes. 3 rows ahead, a man in his late 60s had been watching. He wasn't dressed like the others in first class or business. No tailored suit, no expensive watch, just an olive cardigan over a collared shirt, a faded cap tucked into the pocket beside him. His face, lined with age but sharp in its focus, had turned to follow Marcus earlier. And unlike the others, he hadn't looked away. When the food cart had skipped Marcus, he noted. When the seats were reassigned, he leaned forward. And when the flight attendant had smirked at a private joke, he narrowed his eyes. Now, as Haley passed his row again, he stopped her. Not rudely, not dramatically, just firmly. He asked a question. A simple one. Why was the man in the back being treated differently? Haley blinked, then replied in the same tone she'd used all flight. Polite, practiced, with just enough edge to shut a conversation down. There had been no mistreatment. There had been a reassignment due to a comfort request. The man in question had been uncooperative. He said he had been watching the entire time and saw no disturbance. His voice was steady but not quiet. A few heads turned. That was all it took. Moments later, Brent approached, lips pursed in forced professionalism, and reminded the older man to respect flight staff authority. The man calmly repeated what he saw. Brent's tone sharpened. This was no longer a dialogue. If he continued, Brent said he would be reported for interference with crew operations. If the incident persisted, it could result in a permanent travel restriction from the airline. The man, still composed, shook his head and leaned back, but his message had already punctured the cabin's veil. Others were now watching again. The silence, once complicit, was now curious. And curiosity, Marcus knew, was the first fracture in any structure built on false order. Back near the galley, the head purser, a woman named Dana, had joined the conversation. She walked through the aisle like a judge entering a courtroom, her expression neutral, posture rigid. She stopped beside Marcus's seat with a clipboard in hand. Without introduction, she informed him that his behavior earlier had been logged. He had delayed service, disrupted seating flow, and refused to comply with directions from staff, or that an official incident report would be filed. Marcus looked up, calmly. No voice raised, no rebuttal. Dana scribbled something on the form as if his silence were an admission, then walked away. A few passengers exchanged glances. One woman whispered to her partner, who responded with a shrug. No one asked questions out loud. No one demanded evidence. The report, like the reassignment, like the missing meal, like the smirks and stares and moving of seats, would be filed without a single clear act of misconduct. It didn't need proof. It just needed compliance. Marcus turned his gaze to the window. Outside, clouds drifted far below, bathed in moonlight, ignorant of the injustice moving above them at 600 miles per hour. His breath was steady, eyes still, mind exacting. They had written their version of the narrative, but the story was not theirs to finish. His role, carved by quiet resistance, was no longer to react, because the higher the tension climbed, the sharper the fall would be. The report would circulate through internal systems, flagged for review by some obscure compliance department, where no one would ask the most essential question: what exactly had this man done? But Marcus wasn't concerned with their reports anymore. The damage was done. Not to him, but to them. Because while they had spent the last 6 hours writing the script of humiliation, Marcus had been preparing the reveal. The seatbelt sign had turned on again as turbulence approached, though it was light and barely noticeable. Still, the captain's voice came over the intercom with steady cadence, reminding everyone to remain seated. Dana returned to the front, speaking quietly with Brent and Haley behind the curtain. A murmur passed between them like static, but Marcus was no longer watching. His attention shifted inward. A vibration on his wrist signaled a message. He tapped his watch, scanned the screen, and pressed the call button. Not for assistance, but for action. The phone, silent until now, came to life against the low rumble of engines. He answered it with no hesitation, his voice low and unhurried, barely audible even to the passengers closest. The words were simple. Proceed with the disbursement. Yes. Execute by 600 GMT. Then he ended the call. That was all. No emotion, no performance. Just a line of instruction, delivered like someone used to directing billions across oceans. One row ahead, the older man who had spoken up earlier shifted slightly in his seat, eyes narrowing with recognition. Behind him, a younger passenger in a business class aisle leaned forward, elbow resting on the divider, gaze sharp and unblinking. He whispered to the woman beside him, not loud, but not secret either. That's Marcus Washington. The name hovered in the air, not shouted, not exclaimed, but with the weight of realization. The woman blinked, confused. He nodded again. Marcus Washington, CEO of Gen X Holdings, the one acquiring Skyspan in that massive merger, the one they've been talking about on Bloomberg for weeks. The woman's eyes widened. She turned subtly, looking toward the man in row 27, not with pity but with the dawning sense that the plane they were on no longer belonged to who they thought it did. Inside the galley, Haley returned with a pitcher, but as she neared Marcus's row, her pace slowed. She had heard the voice, caught the tone. It wasn't the words themselves, it was the precision, the absence of hesitation, the authority so complete it didn't ask for validation. She stopped mid-aisle. Something cold passed through her. She turned abruptly, walking back to Brent with uncharacteristic haste. He asked a question she didn't answer fully, just shook her head, said something about checking the manifest again. Her hands trembled slightly as she pretended to scroll, but she already knew. Near the back, a man in a blazer who had boarded without fanfare now sat upright, phone in hand, typing furiously. Another executive, another pair of eyes finally piecing together the pattern. The company acquiring Skyspan wasn't anonymous. It had been headline news in the financial world for the last 90 days. Analysts had dissected it, shareholders had speculated on it, and now, the man quietly holding a closed briefcase near the laboratory, the one who had been moved, mocked, starved, and silenced, had just confirmed his identity with 6 words over a phone call. Marcus did not look around. He did not smile. He simply closed his eyes and allowed the final piece to fall into place. For hours they had viewed him as a threat, as an inconvenience, as a mistake in the matrix of privilege they assumed was theirs by default. They hadn't recognized him, not because he was unknown, but because they had never thought to look. That was their failing, not his. And now the irony bloomed quietly through the cabin like smoke. The man they had forced to the rear of the plane didn't just belong in first class. He belonged at the table where the fate of first class and every other cabin was being negotiated. Dana emerged again, her face tight, her eyes scanning the rows. She was searching for control. But the passengers weren't pretending anymore. Whispers trailed through the air like voltage. Some were searching the internet. Some were simply staring. Even those who had once mocked him now looked with unease, the kind that comes when the ground beneath your feet starts to shift. At the front, the crew had grown, disorganized, moving with less precision, speaking in short phrases clipped by urgency. Brent was pale, Haley was visibly shaken. Dana's clipboard had disappeared from view, and her authority no longer sat securely on her shoulders. What had begun as quiet control now felt like panic stifled by posture, and all of it was orbiting around a single man who had yet to raise his voice. Marcus rose slowly, his movement deliberate but devoid of spectacle, and in that gesture alone the entire cabin froze. Those who had previously ignored him now turned in their seats, instinctively sensing something tectonic was about to occur. He reached into the inner lining of his suit jacket and removed a card. It was black, embossed with a gold seal recognizable only to those who operated behind the curtain, of aviation business. An internal clearance card not issued to customers but to executives, shareholders, and high-level corporate negotiators. With the same calm tone he had carried throughout the flight, Marcus stepped into the aisle and spoke clearly enough for those around him to hear. "The transaction is complete," he said. "The final equity exchange closes at 600 GMT. As of this morning, Gen X Holdings assumes majority ownership of Skyspan Aviation." There was no embellishment, no arrogance, just fact. For a few seconds, there was only the sound of the aircraft engines pushing against the sky. Then came the ripple. It started with a gasp, then the sudden rustling of fabric as multiple passengers leaned forward. The man in business class who had recognized Marcus first sat frozen, lips sidely parted. The older gentleman near the front smiled faintly, as if the universe had finally delivered balance in the most poetic way. A young woman in a window seat near row 15 began recording, no longer out of rebellion but reverence. Brent had backed into the galley without realizing it, one hand gripping the edge of a cabinet like it might steady his career. From the rear of the plane, another crew member approached cautiously, a tall man, mid-40s, with a face that looked familiar. His steps slowed as he neared Marcus. Recognition dawned not with Marcus's announcement, but with memory. Years earlier, he had met this man in a different setting, a foundation dinner hosted in Boston, where scholarships had been awarded to underprivileged students. His daughter, shy but brilliant, had been one of the recipients. She had gone on to graduate early from MIT, and it was Marcus Washington's signature on the certificate that had given her that first step. Now, that same man looked into Marcus's eyes and saw not just authority, but grace. And in front of the stunned cabin, he lowered himself slowly to his knees and whispered, "I am so sorry." The gesture wasn't theatrical. It wasn't meant for display. It was an act of contrition in a space where ego had long dominated. Around them, the other attendants stood frozen, unsure of whether to intervene or retreat. Dana's voice came faintly over the intercom, requesting discretion and calm, but it sounded brittle now, like a glass already fractured. He placed a hand gently on the man's shoulder, not in dismissal but recognition, and gestured for him to rise. He did. Passengers now sat up straighter, some adjusting their posture as if that alone could erase their earlier silence. One woman who had laughed at a joke hours earlier now covered her mouth, ashamed. Another who had filmed discreetly before now deleted the video entirely. What none of them realized was that Marcus wasn't there for revenge. He had made the call to punish, knowing before this plane left the ground. The merger had been weeks in the making. The deal had been negotiated in closed-door boardrooms and midnight video calls across time zones. All he had done was let them show their hand. And they had. With precision. But inside the cabin, change had already arrived. The passengers, once proud in their silence, now sat still in their humility, their glances downward, their postures suddenly smaller, as if the altitude they had carried themselves with all flight had crashed before landing. Marcus remained composed, seated once again in the front of the plane, with his case resting on his lap and the encrypted phone now quiet in his pocket. A new voice came over the intercom, not Dana's, but from the cockpit, where the pilot informed the cabin that upon arrival passengers were to remain seated until further notice. The usual applause that came with touchdown never came, only the long collective breath of a cabin bracing for accountability. On the tarmac, 2 black SUVs and a tinted town car waited near the mobile staircase. The airline's regional security team stood near the vehicles, not with aggression, but with formality, clipboard in hand and earpieces in place. As soon as the aircraft doors opened, Marcus was the first to stand, not rushed, not summoned, just expected. He stepped off the plane into the light, where a legal team and 2 Gen X representatives flanked him. Behind him, Brent, Haley, Dana, and the rest of the cabin crew were asked to remain on board. Minutes later, a uniformed officer entered the aircraft, not a policeman, but a regulatory agent from the Federal Aviation Authority, accompanied by a compliance official from Skyspan's Executive Oversight Board. The announcement was direct. All crew involved in Flight 3 and 16 were suspended pending an immediate internal review. The crew didn't speak. They knew. They had felt it the moment Marcus revealed who he was. They had known when he returned to first class, not with arrogance but certainty. At the airport's press center, cameras had already gathered. The news had traveled fast. A scheduled press release for the Gen X Skyspan merger had been abruptly updated overnight. To include new context, reporters buzzed as Marcus stepped up to the podium, dressed exactly as he had been on the plane. Same coat, same suit, same unbroken expression. He didn't posture. He didn't accuse. Instead, he played a 30-second clip, a surveillance angle from a passenger phone that captured the moment Haley skipped him during meal service. The visible discomfort of one word from Dana. Disruptive. The room fell quiet. Marcus spoke only once, his voice clear. This isn't about a bad flight. This is about a culture that punishes people for not fitting the image of power. But real power doesn't speak loudly. It listens, and it remembers. The press conference concluded with questions unanswered, not out of avoidance, but because the answers were already known. They were etched into the footage, written in the flight manifest, preserved in every silence that had gone unchallenged until now. Within 48 hours, the former CEO of Skyspan, who had built the brand on prestige but turned a blind eye to its prejudice, resigned. His statement was sterile, citing personal reflection and leadership transition. Marcus did not comment. He didn't need to. The corporate board confirmed the merger had closed and that Gen X Holdings would assume controlling interest of the combined aviation group, effective immediately. Marcus's name now sat at the top of the chain of command, not just for Skyspan, but for every company it owned, managed, or partnered with. Behind the scenes, emails were reviewed, crew training protocols were rewritten, and the HR department received an overhaul order from Gen X's Civil Accountability Division. The FAA opened a formal review, not just of the flight crew, but of the entire airline's response history to bias complaints. It wasn't vengeance, it was audit. Marcus had never raised his voice, never demanded apology, never issued threats. The days following the merger were quiet on the surface, but beneath that calm, change moved like a tide rolling through every corridor of the Skyspan organizations. Memos were rewritten, job descriptions were updated, boardroom policies once seen as untouchable were dismantled without ceremony. And in a modest office overlooking the southern wing of the company's Atlanta hub, when Marcus had offered her the position of spokesperson for the program, she hadn't answered right away. She had spent 3 days rewatching the footage, rereading every anonymous comment in the internal ethics report, confronting not just what she had done, but who she had been while doing it. The offer wasn't mercy, it was accountability, and she had accepted it without asking for anything in return. Brent had left the airline quietly, citing personal reasons. He didn't show up in the internal memos, and he never made a statement. But in a community center outside Denver, he now volunteered twice a week, teaching interview preparation to young men with criminal records. One of them had asked him, once, why he cared. Brent had looked at him and said nothing. He just handed over a copy of a resume, his own, marked through with red ink by someone who once had the power to erase his career, but chose instead to reroute it. Haley had stayed, at first out of fear, then guilt, then something else. When Gen X restructured the onboard training program, Marcus invited her to sit on the advisory panel, not for show, not to humiliate, but because her name had been on the manifest, because she had seen what had happened, and because silence once acknowledged could become a voice for something better. She declined the panel seat, but she asked to shadow it, and that request was granted. The man who had knelt before Marcus on the plane now stood at his side during a ceremony at the new training facility in Washington. His daughter, now working for a startup funded through the same educational foundation Marcus had created, gave the opening speech. She didn't mention the flight. She didn't mention the apology. She spoke only about the moment a life can shift, not through power, but through principle. In the back row, the older man from 1D sat watching, arms folded across a chest that no longer carried the need to defend itself. He had declined every interview, refused every press, but when Marcus invited him to the ceremony, he had flown across the country just to shake his hand, because courage, he believed, didn't need to be loud. It just needed to be real. Marcus stood last, in front of a new generation of flight attendants, operations managers, and airline executives. His suit was familiar, his presence unchanged, but the man who had once endured a silent war at 30,000 feet now spoke not as a victim of bias, but as an architect of change. Behind him, the logo for Air Dignity shone brightly. He didn't speak long, just long enough to say what mattered. Justice, he said. doesn't come from power. It comes from the courage to name injustice when it's still disguised as policy. There was no applause at first, just quiet, then hands slowly coming together, then standing. Not for celebrity, not for reputation, but for the truth they had all seen with their own eyes. That night, at a private dinner hosted in a quiet corner of the city, Marcus gathered the few who had spoken up during that flight. The man who had defended him, the passengers who had watched with unease but later sent in statements, the woman who had recorded the moment and chosen to release it not for fame but for integrity. He honored each of them not with trophies, but with a gesture more lasting. The end. If this story moved you or made you think differently about justice and dignity, consider subscribing for more narratives that shine a light on truth and transformation. We'd love to know, what part of this story struck you the most? Was there a moment that made you pause or reflect? And where in the world are you watching from today? Share your thoughts in the comments. We read every single one.